Okay, so this is Blood Meridian chapters 8 through 11. I'm going to try and squeeze everything in a couple of parts here. Just like last time, I'm going to go over some of the highlights, some of the plot points, maybe some analysis to help give you a lens to view this through, so that you have something to reference as you're wading through this particular book. Like I said before, most people find this helpful. If you need to skip ahead, or if you feel like you kind of got it at this point, then maybe some of these you can just review as you come back. But my assumption is that you're at least going to see these or have the information from chapters 8 to 11 that you can use in a meaningful way. So chapters 8 to 11, that's just my, I guess that's my disclaimer, just so that you know this is not designed to be the entire book, right? I'm just making selections from it. You can make your own judgments in some cases. Okay, so chapters 8 through 11, let's see what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to start with the plot from 8 to 10, and then later on I break it into chapter 11 by itself, not for any particular reason, just because that's kind of how the slides broke out. So the plot from 8 to 10, they go to a saloon, they ride out, they meaning the Glanton gang. There's a lot of writing going on, a lot of movements, obviously because they're sort of drifting all over the Southwest, including Mexico. Later on, we actually even get to California for a little bit. But for now, we're sort of in that New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Mexico region of the country, of the continent, I should say. One thing to make note of is that there's a lot of references to people in landscape. We finally figure out White Jackson's fate. This is the payoff for that the fable kind of setup that I referenced in one of the discussion questions, I think. Sort of how one of the chapters sets it up. Once upon a time, I don't know what the actual words, but once upon a time there was, White Jackson and Black Jackson, right? It sort of sets us up to think that this is going to be a fable, and of course fables usually wind up with some kind of meaning that we can derive from them. Alas, we do not get that here. The ending is pretty predictable, and a little bit of nihilism creeps in as we start to think that just as we are getting solutions, but I will go over that a little bit later. They eventually shelter in a presidio. There's an extended scene of some dying squatters. There's a missing boy. Everybody speculates that it's the judge that takes him because it seems like a thing the judge would do. He would kidnap a kid. If you haven't noticed by now, there's a lot of references to the judge, and most of them involve pretty evil actions. They meet some passing trappers. I may go over that quote a little bit later on, but essentially they meet some trappers, and then they pass them sort of as they're moving along. They stop for a night where Tubin tells them the story of meeting the judge. Some references here to storytelling and Paradise Lost, which if I have some time here, I will go over in just a little bit. Okay, so some of the notes. The Black and White Jackson's fate. As I said before, this was set up as sort of a fable kind of idea. And we are supposed to get meanings from fables, much like we're supposed to get meanings from stories, which ostensibly the novel is a story of some kind. But we are constantly coming up short in terms of meaning. I don't think that's accidental, but I do think that some references here tip the hat as to what is actually going on beneath the surface. There's a reference to ceremony that I thought was interesting on my page 112, sorry, when they're talking about sort of the fate of Black and White Jackson. I was drawn back to the idea of Campbell and how ceremony was sort of this thing that sort of has to happen in a society. Any sort of ceremony is sort of a unifying thing in the sense that everybody sort of understands that something has to happen in order for something else to occur. Like the ceremony of, there's a lot of ceremonies as throughout the world and throughout history about how puberty is sort of this movement into manhood or womanhood, and so traditionally there have always been a lot of ceremonies surrounding that. I was reminded of that because Campbell does reference that our monomyth guy from way long ago. So that might be one way of thinking about this, is that there's ceremonies going on in the sense that these things are fated to happen. Again, if we just see Black and White Jackson's fate as something that doesn't have any meaning, then we're drifting into what I referenced before, that idea of nihilism, if you recall, meaning nothing matters. And balancing that with the idea of maybe it's not necessarily nihilism, but more like fate, as in something is fated to happen, right? If we're facing our fate, then certain things have to happen, but there is a meaning to it, right? But the meaning can only be deduced sort of at the end after you've experienced all of this stuff. So fate is something that sort of has to happen, and if we have an impression that that doesn't have any meaning because we don't have any choices within it, or at least no meaningful choices, then we can drift into that idea of nihilism, meaning nothing matters. Okay, so we can think of each one of these little moments, and I'm spending a little bit of time on this because I think that this idea pops up quite a few times. How when something doesn't seem to have meaning, it you can think of it as either having no meaning, meaning the nihilistic attitude of just like, okay, it's just violence for violence's sake. It's just illustrating a violent landscape where violence occurs, and then it has no meaning. Or you can just see all of this as sort of a fate that's occurring. Okay, so I hope that made sense. There's a moment where the judge takes some artifacts from a dead native. Very symbolic, if you want to think about this in symbolistic terms, symbolism terms. But essentially what he's doing is he's robbing natives of their what's the best term? Manliness, livelihood. He's taking possession of those things. He does this quite a few times, so that's another thing that you can reference. How the judge sort of, once he conquers an opponent, he seems to want to erase their meaning or their purpose. Little nebulous, but I'll get back to that. Passages where landscapes take center stage. So once again, as I mentioned before in, I know, at least the last 5 to 7 section, chapter 5 to 7 section, the landscape becomes what I called a character in here. So passages where the landscape takes center stage, try not to skip over them. I know it may be tempting because it seems to repeat itself, and it seems to just be describing sort of this endless expanse, and it goes on and on sometimes for a couple of pages. But you might want to make note of where it does do that, because the landscape itself tells you a little bit about sort of how the mood of the story is going, and it acts upon the people, and that could be one thing that you might want to think about. There's a ghost stagecoach. I was reminded of Tales of Ghost Ships. It evokes imagery of that. Maybe just that idea of abandonment, emptiness, is very evocative. But at one point I did try to look up the idea of ghost ships and what they meant in symbolic terms, or at least in meaningful terms, but I didn't really go very far with that. So maybe for extra credit, you can bring up what ghost ships, what the meaning of ghost ships were, other than maybe the obvious, it's like people are scared of the sea. That's a ancient sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to move on to here. Looks like I might have a few minutes. I like to break these up into 10 to 15 minute sections. So there is a little scene that I wanted to point out before anything else. Is on page 120, there's the judge naked in the Presidio giving speeches. He also seems to be a bit of an amateur geologist, along with everything else. As we go along, we'll find out more things about the judge that are pretty surprising. He can speak a bunch of languages. He's a crafty dancer. Just anything that could possibly be something that he could be an expert in. He seems to be an expert in. So in this case, the judge is naked, which happens quite a few times. I don't know if you've noticed it, but he just seems to, like in the midnight hour, he seems to strip down. Maybe there's something bestial or maniacal about that. It certainly wouldn't be a bad interpretation, but I was thinking about this in the context of how stories work, which is kind of where my mind drifts sometimes. So speaking of the judge, books lie And then the response to that is, God don't lie, right? Somebody says very judgmentally on the judge. No, said the judge, he does not, but these are his words. And these is emphasized, and then he picks up a chunk of rock. That's a direct quote, all of this. So it's a conversation that happens, and I think it tells you a little bit about how the judge sees the world, right? He sees words and maybe even violence against people, or the morality, at least, behind it, as something unreal, something sort of that drifts around a lot, right? The morals seem to drift back and forth. I don't know if you've noticed that, but even the most moral people tend to, sometimes can be their morals can drift a little bit here and there. And what we consider right and wrong tends to drift around depending on sort of who is speaking and who wants to take on that morality for themselves. But when he holds up that chunk of rock, he says, well, the earth is what it is. It's like, I can't do anything about sort of the nature of things. This morality that we're talking about, something that, is so flexible that you can sort of create your own definitions for things. But if we want to think of God as sort of the ultimate creator and the ultimate truth teller, what he created is the only thing that matters, the material that we're faced with. I don't know, pretty heavy stuff. But one of the other things I wanted to note from this entire section is that he seems to be sort of, the judge speechifies a lot. I guess that's not really a word, but the idea is that he makes these profound statements, sort of, you can almost imagine him, well, don't imagine him too much naked, on a rock, in the night, speechifying, about the nature of things. That is borrowed pretty heavily from Paradise Lost, where every now and again in this long epic poem about the fall of Satan into hell and how he gets his minions together and creates, a world, essentially, an afterworld for himself. He does that a lot. Satan will pause every now and again and then go to a mountaintop and just say these soliloquies, these brilliant and evocative and beautiful soliloquies, because, of course, in ancient terms, right, in biblical terms, Satan is known as the father of lies. So in other words, he's very good with words, right? He's very, he'll sort of convince people of things, and that seems to be his role. So he is a wordsmith, and so if you hold stories as having some kind of power or power over people, then you can think of Satan as sort of the ultimate wordsmith. Okay. So that's what I see whenever I see the judge sort of stop and speechify. It may maybe you can look at that as a little bit more entertaining than just sort of the action stops and then the judge speaks these long passages. Know that is intentional, and it's sort of designed to sort of draw you into this moment of charlatan, the charlatan with words. In other words, he's convincing people, and he's very charismatic in that way. Okay, so that will end this particular section, and I'm going to continue in part 2. Thanks.